John's been on with the Morris. In fact, he's on with it right now. So we're doing the Dynamat sound deadening on the inside of the Morris shell. Basically templating all the different areas where it's going to go, using paper, just cutting paper to the shape we want, transfer it onto the Dynamat, cut the piece out, stick it in, move on to the next piece. That's going really well, and it does really help keep that kind of drumming of the panels down, and on a car like this where we're trying to make it fairly refined, it's a really good step. And then on top of that Dynamat Extreme, we'll then have Dynaliner, this half-inch Dynaliner, which is more like a foamy material, which helps further deaden the sound, but it's also quite a good temperature barrier. So the car's going to have aircon, and it'll keep a lot of the exhaust heat out from the cabin and help keep it cool inside. And vice versa in winter. It's going to Scotland, so actually it's probably more commonly going to be beneficial the other way around, where it'll be keeping it warm inside. But that's going in. We do that at this stage because we're then going to do some wax oiling down inside the doors, etc., before we do the wet sanding and polishing of the paint. Just so if water does manage to find its way into the doors, it's not straight into a bare metal seam. And we do the Dynamat before that because any wax oil vapour that kind of drifts out tends to then not make the Dynamat stick. So Dynamat going in, wax oil, and then we're going to be wet sanding and buffing that. I'm standing in the place where the Morris was. That's just gone next door. The guys are going to start wet flatting and buffing the paint. So we paused on that because they were really busy with the Land Cruiser stuff, and we wanted to let the paint harden off for a bit. We got the Morris rolling and did some mechanical work on it but nothing that involved bolting anything to the body, so we could still wet sand it and buffing, and there was no time lost. And we'd got to the point where we couldn't go that much further without starting to bolt parts onto the outside of it. So it's now gone next door for them to now wet sand the paint and buff it to get the final paint finish. Before it did, this morning Max has been over to do the measure up for the wiring loom. So yesterday I did all the wiring planning, did a list of every component that was going to go onto the car. I then print out labels for all those parts, put them all on the car where they're going to go. We'd already planned out the routing in terms of mounts for cables, holes for where they're going to run through bulkheads, etc. So I then basically tape out wires into all those runs where I know they're going to go, so Max can come in, measure up everything, put his input into it, take all the information away, and then he'll go away and make the wiring loom, which I'll go into more detail on when it gets here. So yeah, that was the last step before the car went back next door. Then I'm going to wax oil that and then start the wet sanding and buffing. Morris. Last week, this was, I think, about to go next door, possibly, to do the flat and polish on the paintwork. We'd wanted to get it mechanically built up to a certain point, but we couldn't go any further than, we didn't want to bolt any parts on the outside of it, obviously, until we'd done the flatting and polishing on the paint. So that's essentially where we take the from the gun finish and transform it to being a kind of finished car finish to the level we want. So from the gun, although Gaz is extremely capable at painting and his from the gun finishes are pretty much, I'd say, the higher end of OEM car finishes, there's still a level of orange peel, and we want to get rid of that completely. So they basically start by wet sanding it all with 1500 grit, 2000 grit, and that takes out any of that orange peel and gets it completely flat. And then they use Ferekla G360 cutting compound, which is basically an abrasive paste on a foam pad in a Ferekla polishing machine. And that just kind of machine polishes that flat, dull sanded finish you get from sanding it with 2000 grit and glosses the surface back up. And that, yeah, that's it. There's no real magic to it. It's just putting the hours in. They use generally rubber, just small rubber flexible pads with the 2000 and 1500 grit on them. For some of the big areas, they go with Dura blocks. But yeah, essentially it's block sanding it all with progressively finer grades of abrasive paper and then polishing it up to a good finish with an abrasive paste. So that's done. They've done the bonnet and boot as well. We're just waiting until we're at a point we can fit those. Max is currently working on the wiring loom for this. So yeah, it's all coming together. We were doing a bit of a planning session earlier on what the next stages are. I think we're going to move forward with some of the coolant plumbing on it, start finalising the radiator design. Dean's been working on the seats, so I think next week we'll be able to show you the seats. I thought we might have them this week, but they haven't arrived yet. So that's that. Another thing we've got to do is design the fuel tanks. That'll probably be one of the next jobs, is going to be 3D scanning these apertures here and doing a CAD drawing for these fuel tanks so we can get those fabricated, which actually ties in a little bit with the Morris, because we've done the drawing previously for the Morris fuel tank. We were about to send that off. We're just doing the final checks to make sure we've not made any mistakes. And Adam actually made a valid point that he was a little bit concerned over whether the tank would actually fit through the boot aperture to get to its final location. So he's just been cutting out a 2D template in wood, I think it was, to see if we could actually get it at the right angle to fit it in. I think it's proving to be okay, but we're just going through the final checks so we can send that drawing off. John's been working on the Morris as well. He's been running the battery cable, which is running down the sill. The same with the main wiring loom will run down the sill on the other side. We put holes at the front and back of the sills at the metalwork stage to run that wiring through. And conveniently, where there's those big punched holes on the outside of the sill, which eventually get covered with a cover plate, that allows us to get in with A, to feed the cable through more easily, but B, we can get in with an Allen key to do up bolts in there, so we can actually put cable clips down the inside of the sill, inside the sill aperture. Whereas normally if you wanted to run a cable down the sill, it's just got to sort of sit in there because you can't get inside there to hold it in anyway. So it's quite nice that they're there. George is just on with the mock-up fit-up of the doors. So there's so many new components, the exterior handles, all the pivot mechanism that holds the handle, the cranks that operate the central locking motor up to the lock mechanism. They're all newly designed components. The glass is new because it's now not got the quarter light anymore. There's so many new things in there. I wanted to do one more final fit up of everything with every rubber seal, etc. in place before we pull the trigger on a few of the machining jobs. So the machining of all the components of the door lock that I just talked about, and also the little triangle at the front of the door where the mirror attaches. That's another bespoke part. So I just want to check all of those before they get machined. So he's about to be swearing at that door frame in a minute, I imagine. We've left them unpainted at the minute for the same reason, that I wanted to just be sure all the holes and things were drilled in them correctly before we painted them. But yeah, that's the next step on that. George has also been scanning the dash in that. So originally there's like a little glove box cubby hole in that big aperture on each side of the dash, two of them. Now there's so much stuff behind the dash on this one. There's vintage air heater AC unit on the near side, all the brake and clutch master cylinders on the off side, that there's no reason for those to be able to open anymore. So they don't need the handles on. They're also quite small. There's quite a lot of gap around them. We don't want the chrome beading that used to sit around them. And the hinges sit into a recess at the bottom. And because we don't want the hinges there, the recess would then look out of place. So it all added up to actually making new pieces to go in there. So we're 3D scanning that so we can then machine some new inserts that actually are just fixed in there. They slot in and clip into place, but don't hinge, so they don't have any of those redundant details on. So he was doing a 3D scan for that. They're ready to go back in the casings, and then while he was on differential build duty, he's doing the MX5 diff for the Morris. Now on that one, literally everything is new, I think. So we've got is it new crown wheel and pinion as well, isn't it? Yeah, so new crown wheel and pinion, new diff, obviously all new bearings and seals. So I suspect that one's probably going to be more traumatic. And it's also of the type, whereas on the Land Cruiser one, the shim isn't behind the bearing on the pinion shaft, so it's dead easy to take everything apart, change the shim, put it back together, tighten it back up. I think on the MX5 one, I'm right in saying the shim is behind the bearing, is that correct? So it means that, yeah. So on those ones it's a lot more difficult because the bearing's basically pressed on after the spacers. So usually the procedure there is that you use a bearing that's definitely the same thickness as the one you're going to use, and grind out the middle of it so it just slips on. So you can do basically a dummy mock-up build and adjust the spacers by easily removing that bearing, and then once you're happy with that, then put the final bearing on and press it on. But yeah, with it being, I think, aftermarket diff, crown wheel, pinion, everything, I'm already predicting trauma. So let's see how that goes. Also on the Morris, speaking of trauma, we decided to do a final mock-up build of the electric window mechanism, the mock-up window we'd done for the single piece glass, and the held fire on painting for exactly this reason. We wanted to do a final fit up to make sure it all fitted perfectly with the actual seal in the door shut, and we are having a few issues. Getting the glass to come up perfectly into the frame at the top when the frame is pushed out by the seal at the top is giving us a few complications. When Stu did the mock-up during metalwork, he had some slightly different seals in there, and they were actually, I don't think they replicated the force that we've got now quite right, so we might change the seal profile. We've pulled the runner in very slightly at the bottom, the sort of front glass runner, to get the angle of the glass slightly more out at the top, because it's just only by sort of, we're talking like millimetres, it's probably 3 millimetres too far in at the top, but it just means it kind of catches the side of the door frame as it's going in, and you can like put the lightest amount of force on it and it'll go up into the channel. But obviously plastic bends and glass doesn't, so we're trying to iron everything out and get it perfect in the plastic, so when we've actually got a non-flexible glass window in there, it should all work correctly. So a little bit of trauma there, which we hoped we wouldn't have, but it's being resolved. Fuel tank, Adam, I think last week actually we saw him just starting to make a cardboard mock-up fuel tank, because we were just trying to check, we knew what would fit in there, but we were trying to check that you could actually fit it into place, because that's a classic mistake, is designing something to fit in a certain space, and it will fit there, but it won't go through the aperture that allows you to get it there. So we've done some revisions on the fuel tank. We also originally we were going to have the fill on the top of the tank coming straight out of the filler neck, and we had a couple of concerns there. One was that we'd have to get the alignment of the two parts extremely good before the tank was made, which would be quite tricky, and there'd be no room for error or misalignment because the link pipe between the filler neck and the tank would be so short. And then we were also worried, because it's going to be a foam-filled tank, to avoid too much fuel surge. We were worried that the sort of splashback off the foam would click the trigger out on a forecourt pump. So we've actually dropped the neck down to being on the side of the tank, quite near the bottom, and then we'll put large vents in the top of the tank to the top of the filler neck to vent air out as you're filling it, but the actual fuel goes in near the bottom of the tank now. So that's ready. There's a drawing there literally awaiting my final okaying on that. But that's getting there, and then John's just working on the wiper motor installation. So it's the old school Lucas wiper that has like a rack that runs in a tube, little gears on the wheel boxes as they call them, which are the spindles that operate the wipers. So we're just forming the actual tube that leads the drive rack, as I call it. That's the official name, but leads that up to the wheel boxes. And so that should be permanently installed pretty soon. The instrument arrived today. I've been looking forward to that. So the main instrument pack, if it goes in the centre of the dash, it's got speedo as the main thing, and we've got rev counter, oil pressure, coolant temperature, fuel level, and volts, I think it is. All on the one unit from Classic Instruments, and it's actually one of their standard format gauges. We modified the dash, the aperture on the dash, to be slightly bigger than standard to fit one of their standard instruments. So they've done their usual fantastic job of that. Very efficient, great company to work with as always. So yeah, we're kind of on that countdown to getting everything together on the interior. I've just ordered the material to do the door cards, so as soon as George has finished doing the mock-up build on the door window mechanisms and they've been taken apart for paint, we can start patterning up and doing the door cards and the rear quarter cards. Dean's working on the carpet at the minute, so all of the different parts are kind of taking shape, and they should hopefully come together fairly swiftly once we've got to that stage. If I smooch around here, if that's a word, well, it is a word, but it doesn't mean walking. The Morris is on the ramp here. Guys are just on with the aircon compressor installation. So Adam designed a mount which has been machined by Andy at Concept 303 for the aircon compressor. We've used just a generic sanding compressor which has got the sort of traditional style threaded fittings on it and is nice and compact. That sits in there really nicely, and then they've just been sorting out the belt run for that. That's all looking nice and neat, and I think John's about to, or in fact this is what they're doing now, is putting the front anti-roll bar on that. In other news on this, George has been carrying on with his work on the doors. I think last week we showed that we were doing some minor tweaks to the alignment of the door window runners to make sure that the single piece glass was definitely going to roll up and down nicely without snagging, because it's very easy to get lulled into a false sense of security using wood or plastic dummies, because they can twist a bit whereas the actual glass won't. So the offside door needed a bit of a revision to get the runners exactly at the same angle. The near side's fine. So we're looking pretty good on that, and then that was leading up to the fact we also wanted to finalise the little corner pieces that hold the mirrors. They're going to be machined from aluminium. They're just 3D printed prototypes in there now. So we wanted to make sure that they were holding the frame at the right angle where they bolt up to the frame, and then B, we wanted to get a seat in so we could sit in the seat and check that the angle that the mirrors mount at gave you a sensible range of movement. And it was well worth doing, because actually the initial angle meant that the mirrors needed to be almost all the way to one side of their adjustment to get a decent view. So we've tweaked the angle of those and reprinted some prototypes, which I think are the ones on there now, so that with somebody, well, my height, I'm roughly the same height as the customer, with the mirrors are pretty much in the middle of their adjustment to get a good field of view. So they're looking good. We should be able to send those files off for machining. And now we've done the tweaks on the frames and done the final templates for the glass, we can get the door glass cut. So that's all coming together, and then I think with the aircon compressor on now, John can start working on the aircon plumbing. That'll be his next port of call. And the diff as well, Jim was building the diff last week, which is now done and ready to fit into the casing. So at some point when it's convenient, we'll drop the diff casing back out of this, assemble a diff and get the whole thing in for the final time. And that ties in quite nicely actually with the Morris. I'll come back to this in a sec, but we've got the radiator, the dummy radiator that we made just fabricated in steel, offered up into the Morris so we can sculpt a shaped top tank for it, which we're going to use to give us some expansion space inside the nose of the bonnet. So that's just been mounted up at the minute. John's got that in, and then he's also, while he was doing that, got the aircon condenser and the oil cooler in, so we can start looking at the aircon plumbing. So he's just in the process now of mocking up the aircon refrigerant lines. There's going to be the heater and AC unit, another vintage air unit that goes up behind the dash, so we've also got to mock up the refrigerant lines inside the car that go from the back of the bulkhead to the unit itself. Once they're all mocked up and cut and marked for their angles, they'll get crimped and pressure tested. They'll be ready to go in for the final time. So yeah, lots of plumbing really. I've been doing some work on the water rail on that as well, for the coolant water rail that comes from the back of the head. It's a race line water rail, which they sell for rear wheel drive installations of the Ford Z-Tech. But we're just making a few tweaks to the changes on that. So we need to put some temperature sensors in there, one for the gauge on the dash and one for the ECU. And the position sort of on the back of the water rail on the back of the head is too close to the bulkhead on this. So we're doing some little pads on the top of it, which we've drilled, and Jim's like machined a flat pad and drilled and tapped it so we can put the sensors in there. And then we're going to do a banjo on the side of that rail, where there was already an existing tapped hole, which will then run the heater circuit. So there'll be an outlet there via the heater, or via the bulkhead connections, which then feed the heater unit inside, and then back out through the bulkhead connections to a T that we'll do into the bottom hose. So it's largely coolant and aircon plumbing work that's going on that at the minute. The Morris, John's on with that at the minute. Earlier in the week, James finished the differential rebuild. So I think he was just sort of halfway through that last time, setting up the turning torque on the pinion. We were then getting the backlash set correctly, painting up the teeth, checking the contact patch. In terms of the bearing, the diff carrier bearing preload as well is another thing that needs setting, and there's a there's a number in terms of the distance the case spreads apart with the load of the bearings, and that's actually what's used to determine the bearing preload. So it's a case of using a very big micrometer which goes around the two sides of the case to two given points and working how far the case spreads when you preload the bearing. So that's how that's done. But yeah, with that all set up, diff completely together, that was refitted in the rear subframe. That allowed us to get the shafts in. So that's the back end of the drivetrain done, and the only remaining thing is the prop. So now we've got the diff back in, we're just going to confirm the measurement for the prop, which is slightly different to MX-5 because we've very slightly shortened the backbone. We haven't physically shortened it, but where the backbone joins onto the gearbox, the MX-5 gearbox, we've made the holes slightly further back so we could shorten it. Well, I think it was about 50 mil. So in theory, the prop will be an MX-5 prop, but about 50 mil shorter because it's an MX-5 gearbox and diff. But we're just confirming that dimension. And then we've got the exhaust in temporarily for the minute because we need to just design the brace for the rear subframe. There's a section on the MX-5 that's just a very basic tubular brace that braces up the two rear wishbone mounts. We're going to just design a slightly nicer brace for that, and it's got to clear the exhaust, so we've got the exhaust on for that reason. And then, quite excitingly, the wiring loom was finished. So Max over at Bramax and his crew of guys have been building the wiring looms. So that's the complete engine harness and the complete car harness, which is in two parts. So there's a section that sits behind the dash, connects up to the two PDMs. So it's a pair of ECU Master 16-channel PDMs, or PMUs as they call them, power management units. That then runs down, the rear leg runs down the sill, across the bulkhead, through the bulkhead, and then feeds out to the various components in the back. And actually John's just doing the wiring for the rear lights and rear fog and reverse lights at the minute, just because we wanted to get that done whilst the exhaust was in situ to see how we were going to run it from a heat point of view. The front leg is then plugged in a separate plug which branches off, runs through and down the inner wing on the sort of wheel side of the inner wing, and then across the front panel to feed both lights. And then the engine management harness is another self-contained harness which has a connector into the main loom for the bits that connect between the two. So things like the feed to tell the fan to turn on, the fuel pump to turn on, feed to the tacho, that kind of thing. Max has done a great job as usual. We've sort of gone for all of his looms are very high spec. We haven't gone completely bonkers. If you know, the absolute top end would be Raychem DS25, I think it is, heat shrink throughout, and auto sport connectors, which are incredibly expensive throughout, and everything fully sealed. Now we kind of, on most of these road cars, we go with a slightly lesser spec where anything that's external is built to that spec with fully sealed with Deutsch DT and DTM connectors, and then the stuff inside the car tends to be like a nylon braiding on the wire. It's still Type 44, Raychem Type 44 wire, which is incredibly high spec wire, just unnecessary for it to be fully sealed inside the car. And we tend to use quick make connectors largely inside the car, just to try and keep costs a little bit more sensible, although make no mistake, it's still a fairly expensive wiring loom on the whole. So yeah, we can start getting that in now, which is a bit of a cornerstone again, because when we've got the wiring in behind the dash, we can then get the heater box in, and that really allows all of the dash to go together. So that's where we're at with that. He's just doing the rear strengthening brace. So this is MX-5 rear subframe. As standard, there's a sort of fairly flimsy looking tubular brace arrangement which goes between the two sides of the wishbone mounts, the lower wishbone mounts, and then extends forward to the chassis. Now we decided not to use the bracing to the chassis because the area of the chassis we've mounted to is so much more substantial looking than on an MX-5. But we did think it was probably worth bracing the wishbone mount so they can't kind of move towards each other and flex over time. So Jim's just making a little cross brace arrangement in there, and then that will also pick up on the exhaust. There's an exhaust rubber mount that goes onto that as well. And actually that and then the prop shaft will completely button up all of the running gear on the Morris, so that's pretty cool. Wiring's going in, John's been working on that. The unenviable task of threading the wiring down the sill. generally routing it all behind the dash. He's been mounting the PDMs as well, so we've got a pair of ECU master PDMs, or PMUs as they call them. We'd already made a basic tray that they mounted to, but we just needed to get the exact positions right and put some little spacers under one of them, I think it was, to raise it up so the connector would go above the engine ECU. It's just insanely tight. The biggest problem on this from the start, or the biggest challenge I should say, was packaging everything. So behind what is essentially a standard Morris dash, albeit extended down a bit, we've got a heating and aircon unit, audio head unit, engine ECU, 2 power distribution modules, all the ductwork for demist vents, dash vents, feet vents. We've got the bias pedal box with the master cylinders inboard to keep them out of the engine bay. There's just so much crammed in. The bonnet release mechanism, even things like that, it gets tight to fit everything in. And then we've got audio, we've got speakers in the footwells as well. It's just very, very tight. So Don's just threading the loom, getting all that into place at the minute. He was just pulling the front leg of that through the last thing I saw. So that's that. But I'm going to start with Morris. We've been doing a few different things, actually a few different things with a few different people. So Scott's been working on the panels in what would be the rear seat area. We're having rear seats. If you remember back to when we did the metal work, the areas in the back here house the battery on one side and the remote servo on the other. And then the rear speakers are also in that area. Now we made a cover panel for one side of this whilst it was in metalwork, so we could kind of prove the concept, check that the speakers fitted, check the components fitted and do the mountings. But actually at the time we duplicated the mounts to this side and didn't make the second cover panel. So Scott's been making up the second cover panel and just fettling them both, making sure they're 100%, doing the holes for the seat belts to pass through, so the seat belt reels actually sit under those cover panels and pass out through a little slot with a bezel around it. He's also put in a little square hole where a charging connector socket goes, so we can plug in a C-Tech charger to charge the battery. So they're looking pretty good. I think the next step is just going to be making sure we've left enough allowance around them for when they're upholstered, and then they'll be ready for upholstery. Speaking of upholstery, James is working on the door cards at the minute, and the 3D scanner's been out yet again, so as a convenient way to pattern up for the door cards, we've 3D scanned the inside of the door, which has obviously the whole information on it and the overall size information, so we can get a really accurate drawing for the door cards on it, and then we can CNC cut those out. So he's just working on that literally now. I think he's going to CNC out a aluminium panel for a start. I think the current plan actually, because we're going to do them as 2 layers laminated. I can't remember if I've mentioned this before, but one thing we've often battled with a bit when making door cards is where you have the clips coming through holes in the card. The back side of the clip is obviously on the visible face of the card. And although you obviously go over that with foam and whatever upholstery material goes over the top of that, you tend to be able to still see little bumps from where those clips go through. And both ourselves and Dean at Trimworks, who does our upholstery, have always battled with that problem. I think the current solution Dean's been working with is doing a thin layer of foam over the top with holes around the clips, and then another layer of foam over that without the holes. But then that runs the risk of being able to see inward dimples where they are, especially if you end up pushing hard against the card. So we came up with an idea to try for the first time on this one, which is actually to do the door card itself as 2 laminated layers. So that's what we're going to do, is basically 2 thinner than normal layers, 1.5mm thick, to make the 3mm thick card, and the holes will only be through 1 layer. We'll put the pins in, the clips in from the inside, get the positions of all of those set, trial fit it, make sure we're happy with everything, and then glue another layer over the top of a solid material, either plastic or metal, so that it's completely solid, a completely plain panel on the inside, so there's no hint of them whatsoever. So we'll see if that works out, but hopefully it will. If anybody else has got some top tips on making door cards and solving that problem, basically using a fastener that's not a screw going through from the inside, a push-in fastener, but without any sign of it showing on the inside, I'd be interested to hear what different people do to solve that problem. Next thing on this, we're getting ready to put the bonnet on. Main reason for that is we're doing the mock-up expansion tank. This is just a sort of mock-up of the radiator. We're going to do a foam sculpted top on it so that then the aluminium fabricator can copy that in the final rad. So we've just been fitting up the bonnet hinges. Stu made those when we were at the metalwork phase. They're like a scissor mechanism and use E30 bonnet gas struts to kind of power assist the bonnet forward, and they have quite a cool sort of forwards and down motion to them. So that's ready for the bonnet to go on now, so we can do that. So I'll hopefully get that on in the next couple of days and start to make some progress there. That's where we're at on the Morris.